So we can get also some insights on what can we do to have our experiences told and actually having access to them, which is something I think that's deeply important for everyone, everywhere. If we didn't have free access to resources, I don't think we're going to be a lot of bisexual and bi plus collectives everywhere. So Samu-elle, please, if you want to talk us about your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, that's great. Just to confirm, how much time do I have for the talk?
Reasonably all the time you need. 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Even more.
Because okay, so okay, so first of all, I just arrived home, whatever home means. I'm now in the house of my mother, because I just came back from a conference, and I had to, I hoped that the Wi-Fi in the train would be good enough, but it wasn't. So I missed some of the previous bits. So I hope that I won't repeat anything. But rather, yeah, add to the conversation that you've just had. And what I want to talk about is a research that I did in spring in Haarlem in the Schomburg Center, which is which is a lot, but which is also an archive, which contains a lot of material about Black life specifically in Haarlem in New York City. And I tried to figure out something about the life of Claude McKay, who was a very important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. I don't know how much of you have heard of him. I don't want to assume that you know him, so maybe I can say something about him in general. So he was a Jamaican poet who came to the United States at some point in the 1910s, so during World War II, roughly a little bit before, and at some point he arrived in New York, and he was discovered, so to speak, by an old white man. And maybe I can get into my talk at this here, and I hope to tell you something about who he was, while at the same time saying something about my work with the archive, while at the same time saying something about what is possible to say about his bisexuality. Is it even possible to say that he was bisexual? Is it is that a way that we as researchers can speak about a subject who was living in a time where he probably didn't use that word. So it's a complicated matter. But let me try to start from a beginning. So I arrived in that archive, and I opened the first box of material about Claude McKay, and I found a newspaper article that told the story of how he was discovered. Because after arriving in New York City, he was working for some time as an elevator boy, which is a lovely metaphor, what we can discuss about maybe in the discussion. So he was an elevator boy, meaning that he worked in the elevator and carried passengers up and down in a building. One of them was Frank Harris, and he gave him a poem and asked him to criticize it for him. And this Frank Harris was in fact a publisher, an editor of the Pearson's magazine. I think you might know Pearson's. So in the I think nowadays close to the New School, or part of the New School. So he was an editor, and he was on his way to deliver a talk, and he read this poem by the elevator boy, and he was so impressed that he included it spontaneously into his talk that he gave on top of that building. So at the end of his talk, he said to his audience, Here is a man who can write far better or equally as well as any member of this literary club. Yet, because of his color, has to be content with running an elevator. So what we see here, it already says a lot about social mobility. It says a lot about how his racial stigmatization led to Claude McKay being discarded, and this Frank Harris understood or saw his talent as a writer, and he published a short autobiographical piece and five poems in the September 1918 issue of the Pearson's magazine. One of them was Harlem, a version of Harlem Shallows, which is a very interesting poem. I could talk in depth about that because it has changed through time, and there's some queer stuff in it as well. But yeah, there's so much I could talk about, so I have to focus on something. And in this autobiographical piece, he begins as follows. So McKay says, "I am a Black man born in Jamaica and have been living in America for the last 6 years." He uses the word Black, and he uses the word man, and he refers to the fact that he has immigrated, which is also very important for his being a part of the Harlem Renaissance, because you might know that many of the poets of the Harlem Renaissance were U.S. American. So there were a lot of much concerned with the question of Afro-American politics. But Claude McKay added another dimension next to the dimension of racism. He also was concerned with how it feels like to look for one's home, in the quite literal sense, in a geographical sense, which is why I think in 2 of his novels the word home is also contained in the title. And okay, so I think I have to skip a lot of what I would love to talk about. Let me see. So he continues to say that once he arrived in the United States, he discovered himself as a racialized person. So that was something that apparently he didn't conceive of himself as when he was still in Jamaica. Jamaica, as you might know, back in the beginning of the 20th century, was part of the British Empire, and then became independent at some point. But the racialization and the way that it was perceived by racialized individuals living in Jamaica was a lot less violent than it was in the United States at the same time, even in the North, in the liberal, progressive North. So and that's very interesting because it's 100 years ago, already tries to describe how it feels to live in different places with the same body, and that racialization is not the same depending on where one is at a certain time in space. Okay, so I'll just try to point to all these very interesting things, and we have to then try to talk about it, or you have to maybe get interested and buy a book by Claude McKay, and then you'll hear more. So something else that is very interesting is that at some point he started publishing in the Pearson's magazine, and he published other poems. One of them was very famous because it was called "If We Must Die," because it was somehow the start of the Harlem Renaissance. So this was Claude McKay, who then, after somehow starting the Harlem Renaissance, was never in Harlem again because he started traveling. So he traveled to Russia. He was invited by the Lenin government. He was in correspondence with Trotsky, and he went there to the Third International, to the Fourth Congress of the Third International. So he was speaking and reading his poem to the Marxists, to the communists in Russia, as a Black person, as the only Black person, a Jamaican who had lived in the United States, then went to Russia in 2020, which is, I believe, an impressive story in itself. And so he was trying to convince them, or to explain them, how he believed that racialization had to be thought into their way of thinking about Marxism. And for him, also in his novels about Harlem and about the working class, it was always very important to not focus only on race, and not to sort of free it from all the economic implications. So he was very concerned with the sort of dirty life of people in Harlem. He wrote about sex workers, about people who lived on the streets, people who were in very bad economic situations. And he really tried to think race and class together in his writing, which can to some degree be called a social realist writing. So he was that was his way of aesthetically trying to influence politics. And okay, so far I've only talked about his first years and his political views. And what is very interesting is what I have left out of my talk so far, surprisingly, on a conference about bisexuality, is Claude McKay's sexuality. And that was what shocked me when I went into the archive, because I continued, and I could continue for another hour to tell you about how Claude McKay's life went on and how it's archived in the Schomburg Center in Harlem, but there's no mentioning whatsoever about his sexuality, which is very surprising, because there are poems, there are phrases, passages in his books that indicate very clearly that he had relations with men as well as women. And yeah, it says a lot about how archives work, how research in the 70s, 80s, when the archives were collected, how it was done at that moment in time, when the first biography of Claude McKay were published in the 70s and 80s. So there was never any mentioning of Claude McKay's sexuality. And at some point they started to say something like, yeah, it's mysterious, we don't really know, nothing can be said. And then at some point they started sort of murmuring, and they added, okay, maybe one could say that he was a homosexual. Of course, the term bisexual was nothing that came to their mind at some point then, but that's already in the 2000s. Someone said something like, oh yeah, maybe he was bisexual. Would that be something, a category that could fit here? But yeah, that's 80, 70 years after all these moments, after really engaging in the Harlem Renaissance, where there were people like Langston Hughes and others. Their names just don't come to my mind, but there were so many important writers in the Harlem Renaissance who were queer, who were gay, who were trans, who were lesbian. And Claude McKay, who I believe is one of the most important writers, and also a very heroic, kind of openly bisexual person. He really published his poems, so it's not like he hided it. He was married, he had a daughter, and still he has one poem, very interesting, where he talks about his love to a police officer as a Black person, writing about a love with a male police officer. That's really fascinating. So that's something one could write a whole book about, I think. How does this work out? How do we make sense of that? especially nowadays where Christopher Street Days and Pride parades and the role of the police in those situations is very, very contested. I think it's worth looking back at someone like Claude McKay. So yeah, I think I've talked more than enough. I think my 10 minutes are over, and I've only tried to cover the first 2 of my 20 pages. So there's really a lot to say about Claude McKay. I hope that you got a first impression, that he's a very interesting character. He called himself an international socialist, which is also a term that I really like, that we can discuss about. How does it relate to bisexuality, thinking about class, thinking about race. It's not something that we just start with now, that people say, oh, maybe we should think queerness together with that. No, in fact, it was already started by queer individuals more than 100 years ago. It's just something that we erased from historicizing queer lives and queer politics. So yeah, maybe let me just stop and yeah.
That's okay, Samu. I think you've painted a great picture, and I think we are all kind of familiar with similar stories in our country or in our history of different figures that actually they were not identified or even codified as Y+, but they were kind of pushed or forced to be or to tell themselves or identify as something else. Also, again, thank you, Pauline, for saying that the account by history on Instagram as a link tree. And also there's many good posts. And they also have one about June Jordan, a bi poet and civil rights activist that wrote on bisexuality and freedom. And that's also resonated with Pauline. Actually, we have something similar about our bi history in Italy. We had our first movement called the Revolutionary Front of Homosexuals in the 70s. And some people of that movement were actually bisexual, so they engage intimately. We have men and women, and of people who actually claim that kind of fluid identity about their genders. But somehow the term bisexual were not really mentioned in the political writings of those times. And they were still considered as promiscuous or just covert gay men or women in relationships just to have their bisexual privilege. But actually, some activists recently, and by recently I just mean by the 2090s, they disclosed that they were trying to do a coming out about being bi in the movement, in these movements around the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, but they were kind of forced to call themselves lesbians or gay, and that the early movement reacted very negatively about them being bi more than the society for being non-heterosexual. So thank you, Samu, for this interesting talk. And if anybody want to ask some questions or even provide some discussion on relevant examples or some of your experience, that will be really interesting, so we can have a bit of a talk. Yes, you go. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was listening to your account of the traces of his bisexuality in the poetry, and this reminded me, you know, that the double evidence problem is that somebody has a quote unquote opposite sex partner, you've proven their heterosexuality. Somebody has a quote unquote same sex partner, you've proven their homosexuality. But if you want to prove their bisexuality, there needs to be mention of a male partner and there needs to be mention of a female partner. And that's something that can really mess with archival efforts. And it's when you know, if you're going by the law of numbers, if somebody expresses a queer desire, it's more likely than not that this queer desire is not exclusive to a single gender. And I think that's something that complicates archival efforts. And there's an article about from Priscillo and Cooper on archiving asexuality that talks about looking for asexual resonances, because they say that today's modern concept of an asexual identity, you can't really go back in the past and look for people who are going to say I'm asexual, because that's not how things work. So instead, I have to look for traces and resonances. And when I read that, I thought this was really interesting and applied also to archiving bi plus experiences, because you often have to look for those traces and not for people straight up saying I'm bisexual, I'm pansexual.
Thank you very much. I've noted that down. Could you put the name of the article in the chat?
It's in the
I
chat
put the link in the
already.
chat. It's there already.
Okay. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Samu. Also, just wanted to check if Emily Harvey or Mel McGuire are here. They also wanted to say something, but I can see them in the chat. But regardless, as I wrote on the chat, like there's a lot of characters, like even in historical figures, like, oh, they were roommates. I think that's something that happens quite too much. Even for historical, political figure, even for sociologists and academics. Like we had our good chunk of bi plus scholar that we never know they were bi because though their biographers didn't classify them as such. So that's also something that happens. But if anybody wants to ask some questions or talk about bi lives and bi archives or bi history, I think that would be really interesting if you want to compare some experiences on this.
Sorry, I just a quick comment that also Cary Grant had a roommate quite famously, and for movie historians that has generated quite a lot of questions. So in terms of reconstructing lives that were non-monosexual, but as Hugo said before, the words are different now, and so it's very hard when dealing with archives, because archives, I mean, for starters, they have been filed with rules that are very rigid, and our ways of dealing with archives are not the ways that archive thought researchers were, going inside and looking into these things. So it is particularly complicated to uncover these aspects of important figures that we want back in our history. And on the other side, there is the risk of essentializing, of making, exemplary cases of these famous bi people that we don't even know what happened in their lives. And so it's a very complicated thing to do. And so I was commending your work on this figure, because it is not easy, and probably we would need a different methodology of dealing with this kind of work altogether, because it is impossible to do it following the previous rules of archive. Yeah, I mean, in media, which is media and cinema, which is my field, we have a plenty of names that we now include in bisexual history, but nobody ever called themselves bisexual because that was unthinkable. And so what do we do?
Thank you, Lucia. Yeah, that's great. Actually, with a bi plus activist from Brazil, Helena Monaco, the Italian bi plus network of research, we did an event on the bi erasure of Marielle Franco, which was extremely powerful and great bi activist. She identified as bisexual multiple times, even using different identities or multiple identities as a political path of her journey. She was assassinated by the Bolsonaro regime, but everywhere they were talking like just a lesbian activist, homosexual activist, and her bisexuality and her bisexual identity was raised um, all over the internet and a lot even in Italian media. And it was painful just because it was painful because you think as an activist that even if you identify yourself and something happens to you, people will still try to erase your identity even after you're gone. And they don't believe your identification. How do you talk about yourself? How do you talk about your political struggles as a queer person? It was really bad time, but as the Italian bi movement tried to build a counter narrative on that path, and I think it will happen again, because as bi plus activists, we are often assimilated in that path. I don't know if anybody here has any similar stories, or if you heard about some famous people or activists that actually had this kind of erasure or something similar. Yes.
Yeah, at the same time, I think it's easy to go into like the other extreme and trying to claim every historical figure or every like famous person who can no longer speak for themselves as bi, when there's uncertainty. And in one sense, there's all like this push and their resistance to having them having their bisexuality and knowledge that comes from monosexism. On the other end, there is uncertainty. These people are no longer there to speak for themselves or to talk about how they actually do. Like, let's say Mr. Roger. There's an account of one of his personal friends after he passed away, who mentioned that Mr. Roger at some point says, it's good, I'm paraphrasing, but that you know, like there's love for men, there's love for women, and that if he had to speak for himself, like there's men that he has love and there's women that he has love and that he's been attracted to. But this is all that we have to go on, right? And what do you do with something like that? Because I think that rushing to claim everybody the moment that there's a hint or resonance might be one extreme, but at the same time, there's going to be this pushback from monosexism and monosexist attitudes to no, Mr. Rogers was straight, right? That's just one thing. One of his friends says you can't like use that, which is the other extreme. But you kind of need to be able to hold ambiguity when you're dealing with that, and to be like, these traces are there, this is what we know, it's a possibility, but he's not there to speak for himself anymore. And it's what do you do with that, right? That's not simple. And
Oh, that's a huge point. You go even after when someone, if you want to chip in on this, like how do we account for internalized biphobia and panphobia for historical figure, for icons and everything? Because I think we did as a community a lot of work on deconstruct internalized biphobia, but like if you read texts from the 70s, the 60s, or even before, that was not even something that was possible. Maybe you had some like we had the free sexual utopia of the 60s and 68 and everything, but it's totally different from just saying, okay, I can deconstruct monosexism in culture, in spaces, in relationships. So how do we do that? Like how can we manage this kind of narratives? Yes, Samu, please.
Yeah, that's a great point. What I was really what I really understood when I went to the archive was the role that the person who had archived material, how much that played into the way that we perceive history. So that was something that just because I always just read books, I forgot that there was a person who put something in the book who is not even named, because it's just the person who selects, who collects, who chooses, who hierarchizes, who does all that. The person, there was some, for example, some letters of correspondence where the archiver, the person who was writing the biography of Claude McKay, said something wrote to a university and asked to have access to some letters, and then the university replied, "Oh no, sorry, we can't send that, and we can't make a photocopy. You have to step by into our university to get access." And then the researcher said, "No, sorry, I can't come. That's too far away." So because of mobility, he wasn't able to have access to that certain kind of information. And that influenced the way that he was able to write about Claude McKay in the end. I don't know. I think probably it was not that important information, or maybe it was. We will never know. And I think that's so very important to think about, that there is always a transmitter, a certain medium through which we are able to perceive something that happened before. And in this case of Claude McKay, it becomes so very materialized in the way that I can only access what happened 100 years ago by going back 50 years ago and seeing it through the lens of the 70s and 80s with a particular perspective on racial politics, a particular perspective on women, how are women treated in the way that the archiver, who of course was a man, then saw Claude McKay's work, and how much did he believe it important to write about the role of women in Claude McKay's life. So all that is so much influenced not only by how I look, and my subjective sort of question of interest shapes my research, but also the research of people who came before me. And I have to deal with all that, and it's impossible to forget it. So I always have to resist the canon, the archive. And I guess that's something that holds for bisexuality in itself as well, that it always sort of stands in relation to something, to the big term of gay, lesbian, and heterosexual. And we always have to, I think Helen Bowell started with it in the beginning, with the in-betweenness, sort of to reclaim. Yeah, I thought of it like maybe it's like the elevator boy who's not quite positioned on any floor, but he still has a place, which is the elevator. and it's the most mobile place in the whole building. And I think it's very interesting to maybe think about bisexuality as the elevator in the building of the fragmented floors of sexuality.
Yeah, I think that that resonates a lot. And also thank you, James, in the comments, that when they are talking about we should avoid essentializing bisexuality as something just like rigid or immutable, something we can apply to any historical context without taking into account different social cultural construction. And as an Italian, I'm kind of tired that every time we discuss bisexuality, it always gets back to the Romans and the Greeks. I mean, yeah, that's also a part, but it's really difficult just to put the label bisexuality on something that happened in a totally different way as we understand it. And I think politically it's not just possible to, whenever we discuss like bi politics or bi rights, yeah, but the Romans used to do it all the time. Yeah, okay, I don't care personally. I think we should move the conversation further. But sometimes we only talk about bisexuality here just in the context of ancient history. But yeah, thank you, Alan, for saying really interesting ideas about reflexivity and being aware of our own positionality in our research. So I think that's been a great session, and thank you everyone for all the insights and good discussion. If there are no more question or things anybody wishes to discuss, I think we could move to the next one.
Maybe can I just make a short advertisement, because we're organizing, I don't know if you've heard about it, the so-called Euro Bi Plus Assembly in January. And we would love to have all kinds of researchers. We had to sort of focus on something, but I think in fact we're open to really everyone. So because it will be online, and we will try to do it at times which are somehow accessible for everyone, and we would love to have people presenting and the topic will be particularly bi+ politics. So yeah, I mean, there have been so many interesting talks already, and there will be so many more to come. I would love to hear many of them. I will share the link to our Instagram in the chat.
Thank you. Yes, that would be great. I've already seen a bit. I'm really curious about this event. And so thank you, everyone. I think we can move to the next topic of the day.